Hi everybody, I'm Ryan, and today we're going to talk about Domain and flex slots and different builds in the Domain deck. Let's start with the cards you have to play. So these are the non-flex slots in Domain. Is these 41 cards in the main deck, including a bunch of lands, and these 5 cards in the sideboard. So when you decide to pick up Domain, you're certainly playing these 41 cards in the main deck and these 5 cards in the sideboard. So the decision you have to make is what 19 cards are you filling these slots in the main deck, and what 10 cards are you filling these slots in the sideboard? These are your options. You have 45 cards to pick from in the main deck and 27 cards to pick from in the sideboard. Now, I think this is kind of obvious to say that there's no major stock list for Domain at the moment, which is a little rough, but also very good because you can kind of twist it to be able to support whatever you think the meta is going to be. Let's start with why you would pick any of these cards. So you're going to pick 7 of these lands to finish out your main deck suite. And really, I would love to provide insight on the lands, but I'm going to be totally real with you. I'm not good at building mana bases. But you have 16 options to play in those 7 slots. And so, yeah, I suggest playing plenty of green because hitting your green overlord is super important. And if you're playing the pest control version, or like you're playing a bunch of Zur, making sure you have black mana that isn't the basic or Cavern of Souls is pretty important as well. But you're going to pick 7 of those lands. To kind of move further along, the reason you would play up to 3 Analyze the Pollen, most decks are only playing 2 though, is it allows you to fix your mana. Being an essentially 4-color deck is pretty important. And then in the late game, you can collect evidence. We don't use our graveyard, so we can collect evidence pretty easily to grab powerful cards from our deck, whether it be Zur, White Overlord, or Atraxa are our normal targets. You can play Get Lost 3 and 4. Get Lost is a great unconditional removal spell, really good against enchantments. The issue is it gives maps, and maps are really good alongside the Valiant cards in the red deck. So while Get Lost is good against the red deck, being able to trigger Valiant while not using their cards and just like popping a map on their own creature, a map that you gave them, can be kind of rough. So people are going a little bit down on Get Lost. You can play up to 2 Pest Control. Pest Control, destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, and more importantly, it has cycling too. So the reason this is playable in the main deck, even though it's obviously targeting very specific decks, is because it has cycling. You can just have it replace itself. And the reason you'd be playing these in the main deck is it's decent against the red decks. It's like fine, but mostly for the bounce decks, because things like Hopeless Nightmare and stuff like that are really rough, and Pest Control deals with most of the cards in their deck for just 2 mana. You can play up to 2 Split Up. Now, Pest Control has kind of taken the Split Up slot recently, but Split Up being a 3-mana board wipe that doesn't take out your own Up the Beanstalk like Temporary Lockdown does is really solid. It can be a little conditional, but frankly, the decks that you want Split Up against are the decks that are either going to have like all their creatures tapped like Convoke or Aggro. So Split Up is totally solid. Speaking of Temporary Lockdown, you can play up to 3 Temporary Lockdown. It is a less conditional removal spell than Split Up against the decks that you want these cards against. However, it takes out Up the Beanstalk and like any tokens you have, so that's a little awkward as well. You can play Zur number 3 and 4. Now, Zur is excellent because you can man up the giant enchantments that you have, especially the Impended Overlords, and when they attack, you can still get their attacking triggers. You know, they have Death Touch, Lifelink. It can be total game ender a lot of the time. The issue is Zur doesn't really do anything on its own, so it's a little weird, and people are going down from the original 4. You play 1 Beza. Beza is decent against pretty much every deck but the combo decks. It gains life, it's a blocker, it's a threat, sometimes it can draw cards or ramp you mana. It's just all around decent against super aggressive decks and super slow decks. You can play a single Day of Judgment, just more unconditional removal than Split Up or Pest Control, though notably Pest Control deals with non-creatures where Day of Judgment doesn't. Seized from Slumber is really interesting cards that a lot of decks are playing. They're playing up to 3. Seized from Slumber is a 5-mana instant that says destroy target creature. However, it only costs 2 mana if it targets a tap creature. So it's a 2-mana, pretty unconditional removal for these aggressive decks. And so people are going down on Get Lost for that because of that map thing I was talking about. I'm not sure if it's good, but it's working for people. You can play Sunfall 3 and 4. Sunfall is destroying or exiling all creatures, which is notably important, especially against the Enduring cards, but also it creates an Incubator token, which is a threat in and of itself. Very good. However, 5 mana is a lot of mana if you plan on using it against the aggressive decks, so it's kind of rough. You can play 3 Overlord of the Flood Pit. Overlord of the Flood Pit being a pretty powerful card if the game's going long. It does absolutely nothing if the game is short. Being able to draw 2, discard 1 with the Overlord impending stuff is definitely excellent in some situations and totally awful in others. You can play the 4th Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is probably the most powerful, like raw power Overlord. However, 7 mana is a lot of mana, and sometimes the tokens just do nothing. So people have been going down to 3, and casting 1 in the matchups that it's good against is normally enough. You can play up to 3 more Herd Migration, so Herd Migration 2 through 4. Herd Migration fixes your mana, kind of like Analyze the Pollen, and then it's also a finisher, and gaining life is pretty relevant as well. You can play a 1 of Atraxa. 1 of Atraxa is pretty nice against those decks that go really long, and pairs really well if you happen to be playing the Analyze the Pollen version, because the 1 of turns into maybe a 3 of or a 4 of or whatever, depending on how many Analyze the Pollen that you're playing. And so in the deep late game, you could just play Analyze the Pollen, grab Atraxa from your deck, and win the game. So you're going to be selecting 19 of these 45 cards to be putting into your main deck. And then let's look at the sideboard. So you're going to be selecting 10 of these 27 cards to put in your sideboard. You can play 3 Authority of the Consuls. These are mostly for, again, the aggressive decks. Aggressive decks are kind of a rough matchup, to be totally real with you. And so there's a lot of cards in the sideboard that are slanted towards these aggressive decks. Authority lets it gain life, makes your haste stuff can't attack the turn it comes out. It's pretty great. You can play up to 2 Elspeth Smite in the sideboard. Again, mostly for the aggressive decks. Also fine against like Mosso Dread Knight and dealing with like the blue Enduring card and stuff like that. You can play Destroy Evil dealing really well with like Shieldred, which can be kind of rough if we have a multiple up the Beanstalk hand, but also really awesome enchantment hate. I've already talked about Get Lost being unconditional removal. However, giving map tokens is kind of awkward. You can play 1 Not on My Watch. Exile target attacking creature. Really solid against, again, the blue Enduring creature, but also decent against the aggro decks. Exile is pretty relevant against like Heartfire Hero and stuff. You can play 2 Beza in your sideboard. We already talked about Beza, but Beza being very good against the aggressive decks and very good against the super slow decks, being a threat, can draw cards and gain life. You can play Negate number 3. Negate number 3, solid against the slower decks that are playing these non-creature spells that we care about. You play up to 2 Tishana's Tidebinder. Tishana's Tidebinder, it is an awesome threat, but countering these triggered abilities is really solid, especially against these Overlord decks. Also turns off the blue Enduring card and all that stuff. You can play 2 Jace the Perfected Mind, very good against these slower decks, especially the mirror match, that are going to go very, very long, allowing you to draw cards in the mid game and mill them out in the late game. Tear Sunder, great artifact or enchantment hate, also unconditional removal for 4 mana if the game goes very, very long. Tranquil Throwback is a little like Beza, in my opinion, where it's decent against it, where it's okay against a bunch of different things. It's decent against aggro because you can gain life and it's a blocker. It can deal with artifacts and enchantments and it's a threat. It's graveyard hate, but not great graveyard hate. So Tranquil Throwback is a jack of all trades, master of none. You can play Obstinate Baloth 2 through 4. Obstinate Baloth is very good against aggro. However, aggro has ways to deal with it. But the big reason that Obstinate Baloth is coming into the mainstream again is because of Hopeless Nightmare from the bounce decks. So the bounce decks are really, really rough. It's a big reason why Pest Control is becoming popular again. If they go turn 1 Hopeless Nightmare, you just go Obstinate Baloth and stare at them, and it's hilarious. You play up to 2 Nissa Ascended Animus. Nissa Ascended Animus is great against any deck that goes very, very slow. It's a great finisher, but also great artifact and enchantment hate, and it is just an all-around great card against these slower decks. We've already talked about Pest Control, but again, it's mostly for these aggressive decks and the bounce decks. You can play a Doppelgang, very good, similar to Nissa. It is just a finisher. If you ever do it for X's 2 or more, the game's just over. And then Ghost Vacuum is a great graveyard hate. So you're going to be selecting 10 of these 27 cards to add to your non-flex slots in the main deck, and 19 of these 45 cards to add to your deck, and then you have your very own but stock Domain Zur Overlords deck. So if you liked this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. That was a long Flex Slots video. Please follow me on other social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.